Hi everyone, and welcome to this sixth lesson in our An Inspector Calls GCSE revision series. If you're sitting An Inspector Calls this year, next year, the year after, and you just want to get some really good information about characters and themes, key quotes for those characters and themes, model paragraphs, context, all the stuff you need for the GCSEs, basically, this channel should be for you. In the 5 weeks running up to this week, I looked at Mr. Birling, Eric, Eva, the inspector, and Gerald. So if you haven't seen any of those videos, I highly recommend them. Obviously, I'm trying to give you all of the information that I can to help you write better paragraphs and ultimately get better grades. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at Mrs. Birling. And if you want to follow along with me, obviously, that's fine. You can screenshot bits of this video if you need to. That's what some of my students do. Or otherwise get pen and paper ready, or you can always pause the video and type up notes. Just make sure you're getting something from this. Ideally, this is ultimately a lesson. So yeah, let's dive in with Mrs. Birling and get started. So as usual, we'll do talk about the character, what they do, who they are, what they represent. Then we'll go into some of the key quotes of the character, and then we will do a model paragraph. So stick around for that. So Sybil Birling. She let's start with what she does actually in the play, and then we'll go into why it matters. So she is an upper class wife. She's a charity owner. She runs a charity for young women, which ends up being quite ironic because she doesn't end up providing help for young women that really need it, aka Eva Smith, right? She is quite a quiet character, sort of more in the background, more low-key than her husband. But she does sort of stand up for upper class and capitalism, and she clearly has a dislike for the working class. So she definitely represents kind of oppression and class division. She's quite interesting. She's almost what we would call a caricature of that. She's almost ridiculously sort of evil relatively to like a normal human being, really. And again, this is all part of Priestley. He hated capitalism, he wanted socialism, so he demonizes capitalism and the upper class and makes them, there's legitimate reasons why in Edwardian England there were real issues with upper class and capitalism. That's true, but he makes them as bad as possible. This is also a word called dysphemism. So dysphemistic or dysphemism. So that's a pretty good term for you to actually remember. So you've probably heard of euphemism. So if you use a euphemism, you soften language. So we don't typically we're very soft around death, for example. So if someone dies, then we say, you know, they're no longer with us, or they've passed on, or they're in heaven, or they're, you know, something like that. Whereas dysphemism is the opposite. It's when you harden things even worse than they really are. So if someone had died, you would say something kind of offensive, like they've kicked the bucket, they've croaked it, they're in the ground, they're worm food, right? Kind of mean. That's dysphemism. It's the hardening, right? So she is dysphemistic in the sense that she's actually worse than any normal human being, more or less. She's a real villain. She's a static antagonist. She doesn't improve over the course of the play. She doesn't really learn from the experiences of the play, anything like that. And she is truly pretty malevolent. I mean, her choices are so bad that they get Eva Smith killed and her own grandchild killed, yet she still doesn't show remorse for it. She still doesn't show that she cares that this has happened. And she knew that she could help Eva Smith, and yet she chooses to exert her power over Eva Smith by not helping her, even when she could, even when Eva Smith was super desperate. And that's why I also think that Sybil Birling is perhaps a bit psychopathic, really. She seems to actually get some joy almost out of harming the working class, harming other people. It doesn't seem right at all. Again, not many people in the real world are like her. But anyway, so she also married down, which is quite unusual. Most of the time, if you're in the upper class, you marry within the upper class, and it was very unusual to marry down. And equally, I said when I was talking about Mr. Birling that he married up, and that's also very unusual. But it makes sense that someone who's in the middle class would want to marry up to the upper class as a progression, right? Whereas it doesn't make as much sense for an upper class person to want to marry down and to marry someone who was a lower social class at that time. But we get a sense that the reason she did it is money motivated, because her husband is fantastically successful in business. And so that maybe explains why she married him. You don't really get a sense that she loves him or that he loves her, really. We get the sense that they're married out of convenience, which is really what they're asking their daughter to do now by marrying Gerald. They don't really care whether Gerald loves her or she loves Gerald. They really care about the fact that they're strengthening their position in society. She comes across not only as a mother that doesn't really care who her children marry as long as it is financially smart, she's also quite ignorant and almost maybe in denial of the characteristics of her children. So she doesn't seem to really understand that Eric is a terrible alcoholic and does awful things and womanizing and so on. She doesn't show a huge amount of interest really in Sheila, other than the ring that Gerald gives, the engagement ring, and talking about clothes and sort of more superficial sort of stuff like that. So she doesn't come across as a very good mother at all. But she does care a heck of a lot about her public image. So she's always thinking about how her public image will come across. So that's her big thing. So what else does she do? She corrects Arthur quite a lot. She corrects her children quite a lot. She stands up to the inspector, even though the inspector kind of wrecks her. And at the end of the play, once she feels that Eva Smith didn't die, she doesn't even feel bad that she didn't give whoever the woman was money, which is quite awful, really, isn't it? So that's Sybil. Let's go into some quotes for Sybil. So one of the most telling quotes straight away is she talks about girls of that class. So there's this separation between herself and those girls. The word girls is very patronizing language as well. Eva Smith is a smart, bright, lovely young woman, and yet she's being called a girl, which is kind of like, infantilizing her a little bit. Sorry, I didn't sleep very well last night because of the dogs. If you've seen previous videos, you know that I've got these 2 Great Danes that I recently adopted and rescued. So anyway, I'll try not to yawn. This is interesting stuff. It's not boring at all. It's just I have had very little sleep. Anyway, so girls of that class. The other thing that it links to is it Sybil infantilizes Sheila. Now, if you don't know what the word infantilizes means, that's just a fancy word for sort of treats them like a child, treats them like an infant. Yeah, so she infantilizes her daughter, and as a matter of fact, let me put that word, infantilizing. She infantilizes Eva, really, and other working class people. Please don't contradict me like that. This kind of shows the power of Mrs. Birling. So she is someone who feels that she should never be interrupted or contradicted in any way. She's talking to her daughter here, but this is also something that comes up several other times with the inspector. The inspector challenges her. He doesn't take any of her, nonsense, basically, and she doesn't know what to do about it, really, because as an upper class lady, she isn't used to being contradicted. She isn't used to being challenged. She really feels that she's above the law, the same as her husband, Mr. Birling, really. They feel like they're really above the law. And even if they're not above the law, then they can bribe the law, right? So Mr. Birling offers the inspector port or sherry or just a drink, and the inspector says, no, I'm on duty. But Mr. Birling normally would feel that that would work and that he would be able to just bribe the inspectors or the police officers or whoever. And also, obviously, Mr. and Mrs. Birling are friends with the police constable who sort of runs the police station. So again, that can suggest some corruption. The fact that they know the law enforcement means maybe they can sort of collude with the law enforcement and not get in trouble. So that's quite interesting too. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. Repetition here, obviously. What's interesting about this one is that it shows her ignorance again. So even when Mrs. Birling is faced with something true that she doesn't like, she just tries to ignore it and not believe it. So that ignorance of the upper class, that refusal to face reality of the upper class and face facts, is also quite ironic, right? Because Mr. Birling talks about how he's a hard-headed man of business, and you've got to face facts and this and that and the other. And he puts on this big tough persona. And yet he and his wife, when facts are actually given to them, like, look, you are partly responsible for the death of this young woman, and also, by the way, the death of your own grandchild, because she was carrying Eric's son or daughter. They ignore it, they back down, they just try and not talk about it. Now, there's a fancy word for that as well. It's called cognitive dissonance. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, cognitive dissonance of the upper class. Basically, they refuse to believe reality sometimes, as if a girl of that sort would refuse money. So again, do you see this repetition of the girl? And this is a stereotype as well. She is stereotyping or profiling the working class as if they're all one group, which is kind of the beginning of pretty much any prejudice, right? So racism is based on the belief that everyone within a certain race is a certain way and is inferior to another race or another thing, right? So that's racism. But ageism, the idea that everyone of a certain age is a certain way. And then here we've got, this class division, which creates this prejudice of basically, in Sybil's mind, every working class person, every working class girl would not refuse money no matter where the money was from. And this is a reference to the fact that Eric had stolen money from Mr. Birling's office to give to Eva Smith. Yeah. And the exclamatory also shows her kind of disgust at the working class. And there's again this just juxtaposition here, because the truth is that Eva Smith wouldn't take the stolen money. And Eric is happy to steal the money. So what does that say about him? But she's not willing to take that stolen money. In circumstances, I think I was justified. The girl had begun by telling us a pack of lies. So again, the girl, the repetition of the girl, patronizing, infantilizing, and also these short, simple sentences kind of show a lack of emotion as well. To her, it's just a business deal almost, even though that's not what a charity is meant to be like at all. She just thinks, no, this girl lied to me. They're also really offended, the Birlings, that Eva Smith used their surname. So Eva, when she came for help, said that her name was Mrs. Birling. Now, the reason she did that, we find out, is because she was with the child, Eric's child. So technically she wasn't married to Eric, but she was sort of becoming part of the family because she was carrying the child of the Birling family. So that's probably why she used that name, not to insult the Birlings. And imagine being so stuck up that someone using your name in a slightly negative light would be seen as grounds to stop them from getting any help, even if they're pregnant. It's dreadful. Like I said, that shows that Sybil is not your average bear. She's not an average antagonist. She's truly evil. It's a truly evil thing to deny help to a vulnerable pregnant woman. And yet she not only does that, but she doesn't even care that she does that. We've done a great deal of useful work in deserving cases. So this is connotations or symbolism. And what she's basically doing here is she's forming a dichotomy between Eva Smith, who she's not a deserving case, and other women who come for help, who she feels those women are deserving. So this is also, to some extent, you could say she's sort of playing God a little bit, because she's sort of trying to decide who deserves what help when, which is not really her place to say at all. I don't think anyone has the right to make that decision. It's a power trip for her. And that again links to her, I think, being a little bit psychopathic. I did my duty. So this is kind of funny. It's a parallel of what the inspector says, because obviously the inspector's like, I'm here to do my duty. It's my duty to ask questions, duty. So this is like a kind of a sarcastic and bitter joke. So she's like, yeah, well, you're doing your duty being here. Well, I did my duty by not giving her money. Mrs. Birling collapses in the chair when the inspector leaves. That's quite an interesting moment as well, because it's symbolic of ideas and worldview being crumbled. Now, unfortunately, she doesn't learn from this and then develop and change. Like I said, she is a static antagonist. She doesn't grow or develop. But this is a moment where she has that opportunity to do so, but she doesn't. Sheila says you mustn't try to build a kind of wall between us and that girl. If you do, then the inspector will just break it down, and it will be even worse when he does. So this is the juxtaposition of mother and daughter. Because Sheila gets it. Sheila understands the situation that they're being put in, and she's trying to help her mum to understand it too, but her mother never gets it. Mrs. Birling never gets it, and then that final quote, the penultimate quote, "I don't understand you." This also shows her ignorance and lack of trying to learn. She doesn't really try to understand the inspector or try to understand Eva Smith or try to understand the situation. And part of the reason for that, these quotes have actually lined up really well today, is because she's a rather cold woman. So obviously you've got the connotations and symbolism of the cold. It suggests that she's sort of uncaring, unmoving, and just sort of unpleasant, really, uncomfortable. Okay, so there's some good quotes for Sybil. So as usual, let's finish up with a model paragraph. We've got plenty of time today, which is nice for once. I was thinking about doing some more Sybil quotes, but I felt like these were some of the major ones. And it's nice for me to have a few minutes to actually write a good paragraph with you. So how is Sybil Birling presented? Why is she a significant character? So as usual, we can go back to the beginning bit here, and we can think about some of the things that Sybil represents and does, that sort of thing, to help us form a paragraph. So I think that my favorite one to write about right now would be to think of her as an oppressive figure to the working class. One of the major ways that Sybil is significant is as an oppressive character within the play. We note this in her interactions with multiple characters. For example, with her husband, what I really want to say is cusses him out, but you can't say that in an essay. So, for example, with her husband, she corrects him and says, "You mustn't talk this way." And in this quote, the imperative suggests the opening stage direction is her husband's social superior. Later in the play, she continually mocks Eva Smith, calling her girl, which has negative and patronizing connotations. And suggests that Sybil believes she is better than people in the working class. Also note this in the comment, "I did my duty," which is mocking the inspector, and Sybil claiming that her duty is to only help, quote, deserving cases. The fact that she feels entitled to decide who gets aid and who doesn't, or money, or charity, and who doesn't, exposes that she is someone that enjoys lording their power over others. and oppressing them. See, that's the beginning point, right? Because if I've started with the oppressive character within the play, then I need to get back to why it's oppressive. But she clearly is oppressive. Even members of her own family or desperate working class women who are pregnant. As the audience, we feel a lot of disgust, or not disguises, disgust for Sybil, and question how anyone could refuse a mother, a pregnant woman. This is significant because Priestley was an ardent socialist. Let me just make this a bit smaller. Priestley was an ardent socialist, and Sybil forms a caricature of the upper class oppressors and attempts to suggest that this is a result of a broken capitalistic system. Vehemently means like aggressively or strongly. I like to give you some nice vocab choices. I've said nice a few times in this lesson. I apologize for that. Nice is not a good vocab choice, but vehemently is. So there's a paragraph for you on Sybil Birling and how she's presented and why she's significant. Hopefully that helps. I think we'll leave it there for today. We actually slightly shorter video, which is good, like 25 minutes or so. But if you have any questions, please just let me know in the comment section below. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And I will be doing Sheila next week. And so please tune in for that. Thanks very much.